Welcome, welcome, welcome to day 3. Here we go. Thank you for you marathon makers. Thank you for opening the session, day 3. Here we go. We're kicking off. I'm here with Mile. I'll give a little bit of framing, but today we're kicking off day 3 around ecosystem building. How do we unpack this concept? What do we mean by that? We've been throwing around that word, and many of us are working on that, but I think it's a really important time to take, a few minutes. We're going to take about, 45 minutes or so with Mile. Mile Boyer from Rios Partners is here. I'm very, very proud to have you with us, Mile. You've known the Hub since our inception. Actually,
That's
it's
true.
probably because you I met the Hub. So I've known Mile way back in an early social network called Pioneers of Change that she was really, cultivating. She created, I was part of her team actually back then, and we shared an office with the first 4 co-founders of the Impact Hub in London. So that was actually, we were just thinking like we're turning 20 since the first Hub next year. So this was, a number of years. And Mile to me has been, I think, one of the people I admire the most in this work of facilitating inclusive ecosystem building, bringing different stakeholders together around making transition in the world. There's so many things I could say, about you, but I think we're going to dig into a conversation about this because I've learned so much from you over the years. So thank you very much for taking time to share some of your practice with us. But the reason this is important for us is not only are we, have we been building communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems, for years. We've learned to do that in many contexts. But I think we've really seen a movement over the last years in applying our community building knowledge, right? And bringing different stakeholders together, not just in the hubs around issues we care about, but actually in neighborhoods and cities at regional levels. And so this issue-based ecosystem building has become a practice we've been focusing these sort of couple of years on. How do we really hone and understand and also codify some of that practice to be able to share more across our network? So I'll share a little bit about that after. I'll give you a little preview after my conversation with Mile about how you can go right into practical workshopping in the next session. So if you don't have that in your agenda, makers, please make sure you stay for the workshop after this, where we're going to get really pragmatic about this. But I just wanted to say, Mile, welcome to the Impact Hub community again and again. And you want to say a couple of words as you enter our morning with us.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tatiana. You bring a smile on my face every time I see you, so it's really good to be here. And as you said, I mean, both you and the Impact Hub have a special place in my heart because of having been around at the beginning. And not only that, but knowing so many of the people who have started Impact Hubs, many of the hosts, and just working from Impact Hubs myself in multiple places, in Sao Paulo, in Johannesburg, in Geneva. And just following really closely the growth of the network. So it's I'm not working from a hub right now or collaborating directly, but we have collaborated also on projects in Brazil, which I'll share about a little bit later as well. So it's I think I'm a sort of champion and an ambassador and a friend of the Impact Hub in many ways and at many levels. So it's really good to be here. And as you mentioned, we know each other from Pioneers of Change and know many of the other Impact Hub hosts from those days as well. We're actually, Pioneers of Change is 25 years and we're putting out a legacy website at the moment, which is going to be nice. I think the Impact Hub probably would have existed anyway, but many people wouldn't be involved if it wasn't for Pioneers. And the company that I work with, Rios, actually, I think it wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Pioneers of Change, because the people and the ideas really came together there. So there's a kind of a longer story behind what I'm doing now and what Rios does. So I've worked with Rios in South Africa and Brazil and now in Geneva. And what we do is really to enable multi-stakeholder collaboration when it's difficult. So when people from different perspectives, different sectors, different interests need to work together because they're interdependent around some societal challenge. And it's difficult because it's complex, it's uncertain, maybe it's polarized, conflictual situations, and sometimes in fragile contexts. And that's really where we come in to help collaboration when it needs to be held and facilitated and enabled, because otherwise it will fall apart or it won't get off the ground. So so that's sort of the um, the kind of bigger framing of what we do, which of course relates to ecosystems. And actually, one of the principles of Pioneers of Change was also about do what matters. And one of our the ways that we frame our work in Rios now is that we're working on we're working on the challenges where we're helping collaboration where it matters most. So maybe I'll leave it there for now and back to you. And looking forward to being in this conversation.
Well, I think that's why I really appreciate, you joining because I think I've witnessed, from afar, but also we've been in a few difficult moments of facilitation, right? And it's I think those moments that you realize this is not superficial. This is not about facilitating something from A to B, just kind of like, oh, let's just do these steps, And even though we will discuss a little bit about a playbook we're creating internally to help codify the practice, I think you said it. It's not just about connecting the dots,
Yeah.
right? And I think we'll get into that a little bit more. But maybe we can kick off because we have such a diverse group here in different contexts. And maybe we can put in the chat, and I know Christine's helping us behind the scenes, is to really to ask you what words come to mind when you hear the word ecosystems. What words come to mind when you think of ecosystems? And maybe we can gather a few of those, just that can inform the way our conversation will go. Great. Thanks, Lynn. Collaboration, stakeholders, connected stakeholders, system innovation, swarm, multi-stakeholder synergies, groups of people from different sectors connect in a topic, dependency, interesting, shift, collaboration, decisions, interdependencies, balance, empowerment, interconnection. Very interesting. Very interesting. You know, diversity, you can feel the movement, in the way that this group sometimes responds to this, acceleration. Very interesting. Yeah, an organism. I mean, it's definitely something what we're gonna talk about today is not static, it is I see it that way. I think it's we've been informed by nature in many ways, right? That it's something I like this, what Neil said about an organism. It's something that has its own life sometimes beyond any of us, right? And as facilitators, or the different roles we play, which I think is something we could touch on a little bit, that you just play different roles in this whole thing. But I'm just wondering, Millie, how you would respond to this, what you've seen and learned in your different contexts.
Yeah, great. And a few of these words stick out for me. Love the little heart that just came on organism. So, I mean, I think
Mm.
the ideas that inspired both Pioneers and Impact Hub and Rios is also around how do we organize as a living system. And so, systems are not necessarily living. Systems can be mechanical and other things, but really, what is it that characterizes living systems? And it is that, dynamic um, and complex piece rather than sort of complex rather than complicated. But the other words that stand out for me is about the synergy and the dependency and the interdependence and the complementarity. And what I don't see here is diversity. Actually, I'm sure it's on people's minds, but I think one of the things that stood out for me, I was just reading up a little bit on sort of entrepreneurial ecosystems last night and seeing how different people frame it. And I think sometimes it can be, as you've also said, Tatiana, it can be confused with community. And I think it's really important not to think of a group of friends as an ecosystem or a group of peers as an ecosystem. If we're all sort of doing the same thing and um, very similar to one another, then I think it's not ecosystems die if they're homogeneous, right? So I think this notion of diversity being extremely crucial for living systems and for ecosystems, and then what do we do with that diversity, right? Like, how do we each play our role in the ecosystem? How do we harness the interdependencies? How do we create synergistic? Another word that's not here is symbiosis, which I really love to think about as well. Like, what is the symbiotic nature of it? Which means not just that we're each contributing to a higher goal, which would be maybe the synergy, but the symbiosis is actually also about acknowledging the different interests of the different actors and parts of the ecosystem, right? So it's meeting multiple needs within the ecosystem, and I think this notion of the issue based and entrepreneurial ecosystems, I think entrepreneurial ecosystems do that as well, but there's a lot of emphasis on centering the entrepreneur and sort of meeting the needs of the entrepreneur, and everybody else has to get in place to meet the needs of the entrepreneur, who is hopefully meeting some need in society. But I think an ecosystem lens on things is really about this symbiosis piece as well, of understanding that everybody in this ecosystem has needs. The funders also have needs. That's okay. That's legitimate. We have to make sure that those needs also get met. The government has needs. The businesses have needs. We all have different needs, and we need to try and find ways of meeting those needs in a symbiotic way. And I love the balance piece that came up here as well, that it's not about one need overpowering the others and, sort of dominant needs taking over the ecosystem, then the ecosystem dies as well. But I think sometimes when we're doing social change work or entrepreneurial ecosystems, we can think of some of the needs in the system as somehow illegitimate or kind of hidden agendas and these kinds of things. And I think it's much healthier to acknowledge the different roles the different players are play in that ecosystem, the different contributions, and what are the needs that they have in order to contribute in those ways. So that's some of what comes up for me when looking at these words. What comes up for you?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I partly also had the word symbiotic, but one of the other things are the fringe voices, and I think we'll go into that when I ask you to share a little bit of your story, because one of the things I've always admired about you was the question always of who's not in the room, what voice is not there, right? Who did we not invite in? And I think that carried to me as an Impact Hub founder and then a host to always think like who's not in the room and who's not here and what's the voice that we don't have as part of the community. But I do think there's a distinction between community networks and ecosystems. And I did a bit of a research about this when I was back at Impact Hub Amsterdam, so before this role. It was interesting. We studied with 40 different initiatives. Rios was one of them. I think the story you'll share from Brazil, right, was part of this sort of inquiry. And a number of our own issue-based ecosystems were also a part of that inquiry. And one of the things we found, and this might differ in different contexts with language, right? It's like, how do communities themselves in their own language and context talk about communities versus networks versus ecosystems, right? And communities, you're right, shared purpose. You want to feel together. You want to feel harmonized. You want to feel like one. You want to feel like you belong to something, right? Belonging is a big trait, right? With networks, often it's utilitarian. Sometimes it can even get transactional. You belong to a network and you want something from it, and you engage more when you get more from it, or you sit more at the edge and you go, what am I getting from it, and such, right? But then when you get to ecosystem, there's a symbiotic relationship where you are an integral part of it, right? But also there you do have, yeah, with the diversity, do you have to deal with the weeds? You do have to deal with things that are unpredictable, right? Emergence happens. And I think that's also another kind of, loaded word, emergence. But it's one of the things we learned, remember way back with our work with like Margaret Wheatley and the chaotic and all that, saying you need a good, that's why the word balance does trigger me a little bit, because if
Mhm.
you get equilibrium, nothing moves.
Right.
A lot of systems sort of exercises you can do where you show if it's equilibrium you become stagnant and it doesn't grow and there's no energy in the system. You do need, in a sense, balance. You need a little bit of attention. So where do you invite creative tension, just enough tension to allow something to move, because I think in
Mhm.
an ecosystem things have to move in order for any shift to happen, anything new to come out of
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it's important not to confuse balance with harmony there, right? Because I think, yeah, I would agree that harmony is also or the kind of insistence on harmony or the search for harmony, and which is a way of quelling diversity, actually, right? So um but if we think of balance as more of this, I agree with the point that you just made, but maybe distinguishing between balance and harmony, because there is something around power imbalances that can also be very unhealthy, right?
as well, and how do you look at, yeah, rebalancing sometimes things that aren't healthy for an ecosystem, and then who judges what's healthy or not, right?
Yeah.
But I think, there's a lot of philosophical questions. Part of the reason of holding this session before we get really pragmatic with what we've been learning about sort of our methodology or approach to this is that, we have a lot of questions. How do you build capacity to do it? So we can, as, impact hub makers, as even like members of our community, right, might be struggling with an issue, going, I really want to shift this issue. And we know that, collaboration can't happen in isolation. We really value the fact that entrepreneurs need to work together with other stakeholders and such, right, to shift the systems, right, that we
Mhm.
see need to change. But the question is not just because we dream it doesn't mean that we can do it. So how do we build capacity for that? And I
Yeah.
know that in the Rios approach, you've talked a little bit about like radical collaboration, and going beyond, like exactly beyond connecting the dots, which is your challenge, back to me and such. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about your approach to this. And I know that you prepared a story because I asked you, I said, that, I think one of the best things is to learn through stories. So
Yeah.
also within our own, I hope that from this session, a lot of our community can share stories about what they're doing at whatever stage you're at, because I think it's through stories we learn really how to respond to something that is sometimes unpredictable.
Mhm. Mhm. Great. Yeah, I want to share. I just want to say one thing about what you said about who's not in the room. So when we do issue-based ecosystem work, it is very important. The word stakeholders came up here as well. So it's think about stakeholders, who's influencing this issue, but also who's influenced by it, right? And to think like quite expansively about that. But you may have some of those actors in the room. You don't necessarily have to have everybody in the room in order to connect with them, right? And so in some cases, you have a certain convening power and you can bring a certain group into the room, but that doesn't mean that that's a closed system, right? So the question can be, how do we connect this group that we're convening to the bigger ecosystem? Because ecosystems are nested as well. And so who else is convening
Big
the other players
permeable,
and how do we
permeable
interrelate?
edges.
How do
Yeah,
we create the
permeable.
symbiosis
Yeah,
between those? Yeah. So just wanted to comment on that. So let me
great point.
just see. Let me hope that I can. uh,
Yeah, thanks, Lena, for capturing that. It's true. And sometimes we forget with Impact Hub, we're so worried about all the other things going on outside of ourselves because we're so busy in our hubs that we actually do have convening power because of our reach with really diverse voices,
Definitely.
folks
Yeah.
that are walking through our doors, right, involved in our programs, partners past and present.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. All right. So the first thing I just wanted to share, some of you may know about this already, but my colleagues did some work in the last couple of years around radical climate collaboration, specifically interviewing a lot of different people working on radical collaboration in the climate space, and then developed 7 do's and don'ts around radical collaboration. And in that process, we reflected a lot on this notion of the collaboration gap. And basically, our theory of change now is there are all these system transitions that need to happen. There's energy transition, food systems that need to change, inequality, so many systems that need to change. And basically, collaboration isn't the silver bullet to all of that change. We need technology, we need policies, we need all these different things. But there is a gap. And the gap is the huge difference that enhanced both level and quality of collaboration would make between our current success and our potential success in transforming those systems to meet the challenges of the decisive decade, which is almost halfway over. So what we try and do is to seek out, if the collaboration is already happening, we don't have to help, but where is collaboration gap where either people aren't connecting or the quality of that collaboration isn't good enough. And so, that I think that's maybe a language that you want to think about as well, of where are the collaboration gaps that the Impact Hub has a role to bridge. Um, and the 7 practices that they identified around sort of do's and don'ts of radical collaboration, there's a whole little publication about this that you can look at. So I won't go through all of them, but I think in particular, when we're thinking about interdependencies, ecosystems, this notion about don't ignore the interdependencies, but play your role. And that's kind of easy to say, but I think it's really, really important for us to understand the role that role plays in ecosystems, and for us to be clear on our role and to play our role fully, um, in relationship to in symbiosis with the roles that others are playing, and without necessarily encroaching on other roles. So sometimes I think as Rios, we also need to stay within our um, within our niche, and then partner with others who have the other skills that are required. And sometimes I think for entrepreneurs or for small companies, even like ours, it's kind of very easy to say, oh, sure, we can do that as well, we can do that as well, we can do that as well. but but it's actually healthier for the ecosystem and for our relationships with others if we pull in partners. And actually, the case that I'm going to share from Brazil is a case where we partnered with Impact Hub. um, then this notion around don't stay comfortable, find the necessary allies. This is what we were talking about homogeneity. Like, don't just work with your friends. Find out, given what you're trying to do in the world, who do you actually need to collaborate with, even if you don't fully agree with them, even if they have a different logic to you, but they are actually the necessary allies that you need to work together with. And the other one that I want to highlight here is this notion around don't demand agreement, but work your differences. I love this concept of working your differences, because we tend to sort of shy away from the differences when there's disagreement, um, or to try and paper over them and say, no, 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 we're on the same page here, or we're really not that different from one another. And actually, that's not that helpful. It's more helpful to say, hey, like, let's actually figure out where we're different. Where's the divergence? Where is the convergence? How can we turn that difference into complementarity? And because that's really where the juice is in ecosystems work. And so those are some of the ones here that I think are a little bit counterintuitive for sort of collaborative minded people. And that's what I love about this notion about radical collaboration. It's not the comfortable collaboration. It's collaboration where we're really stretching ourselves into kind of unknown territory as well. So the case that I wanted to share is the sustainable fashion collaboration, just to give you um, I guess a sort of frame of reference, or a story to associate issue-based ecosystems with. And I think there are many different ways of doing issue-based ecosystems. So this isn't, a recipe, but it's a really nice story. I was involved in the beginning of this project when I was living in Brazil, and then I left, and it was carried forward by my colleagues, Crystal and Lucy Laney. So basically, it's a multi-sectoral platform for collaboration and innovation, of a diversity of leaders who are aiming to address and transform the main challenges of Brazil's fashion industry. And what I love about working on fashion in Brazil is that basically within a 200-kilometer radius, you have the entire system, from cotton farmers all the way to luxury retailers and fashion designers, and the fashion educators, to the illegal immigrants who are working as seamstresses. It's all in a 200-kilometer radius. The industry associations, the intergovernmental organizations, it's all there. And so you can actually get them all in the room together. This is just the partners. This gives you a bit of a sense of who, what was this kind of stakeholder system that joined. So brands, and so private sector, industry associations, civil society foundations, entrepreneurs, some individuals who needed to bring a certain voice into the room, like the Bolivian seamstresses, or a certain consultant on circular economy who had certain expertise or perspectives that otherwise would be missing. Public sector, education, financing, and so on. So what they did was basically, and this is still continuing, it's spun out of Rios now. They started out by interviewing all the different stakeholders, putting together a synthesis of the interviews, and then they started by convening everyone to first develop scenarios for the future of the system, like what will fashion in Brazil look like in 2035, and then based on that, what do these scenarios tell us about the drivers of change in our system, and what is then our theory of how to change this system. And then it moved into initiatives that were working on these underlying drivers, awarding some of those initiatives with funding, and basically doing multiple generations of initiatives and feeding a collaborative platform, all supported by accompaniment of the individuals, seed funding for the initiatives, and then a communications piece. So this is the piece around theory of change, working towards a sustainable and fair fashion industry. Where would we be in 5 years? Where would we be in 10 years? And then what initiatives can we think of on these different areas? And what I love about this is like this, getting the whole system to strategize together around a certain issue and seeing their role within that bigger perspective, as opposed to just doing organizational strategy work, and sort of holding each other to account within that bigger transition. This is a little bit of mix of Portuguese and English, but these are the areas of transformation, culture and consumption, working and conditions, public policy. They worked on tracing, worked on the kind of citizen education, different regulations, and so on. What I wanted to highlight also here is basically what was really interesting that happened here is the ecosystem was created through the lab, and when COVID hit, basically there was already a sense of agency for this collective system. So they had a sense of we are the fashion system or the sustainable fashion system in Brazil. And when COVID hit, they immediately could convene and say, what are we going to do about it? And basically, they developed several different strategies, collaborating to produce PPE. They immediately, because they had done the scenarios work and they were connected to one another, they could say, we can see that this is going to benefit the big corporations and it's going to be a struggle for the SMEs in the fashion industry. You can see that coming as soon as COVID hits. And so they actually developed financial solutions to support the SMEs in the fashion industry in a way that you would have had you don't have time to convene when the crisis hits, but when the ecosystem is already in existence, you can activate the ecosystem to respond to the crisis. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things that happened here. Another interesting similar thing is when George Floyd was murdered, they could immediately convene around how does our system relate to race and racism, and develop some initiatives around racial equity and race in the fashion system in Brazil. And there was a nice collaboration with Impact Hub around this in terms of the impact businesses and the seed funding piece and the acceleration and prototyping piece. And so I think this is a nice example of where um, Impact Hub also collaborated in the context of a bigger ecosystem. Okay, so let me stop there.
Yeah, just a comment, and then we have a question that I'll go to. Um, It's interesting. It really seems to me that what you mentioned, the word agency, right? That it's really about doing something together and making something happen. And I think this is a far cry from the sort of traditional roundtables that many of us have kind of grown up hearing about, right? In policy circles and other circles and such like that, that it's not just about coming around the table, but it's actually making something happen. And it feels to me that actually maybe we often focus on purpose is really important, but sometimes purpose can be seen as sort of blue sky up there, but it's actually the theory of change, because even if there are different routes to that, right, they're all uniting in a theory of change. It's a point of convergence. If you can converge on a shared theory of change to make that shift happen in a particular area, whether it's a
Yeah.
geography or an issue, right, that this is, would you say that that was a point of convergence that was important?
The theory of change.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what I find so interesting about this. And of course, it is this particularity of this situation where you can bring the system into the room to be the system sees itself, right? I mean, the best way for a system to see itself is to get the whole system into a room together. So they build those relationships. It relates to Nils's question around what are the main takeaways, but it it wasn't as clear to me before that project, this notion of agency at a system level. And I wrote a little piece about it during COVID because of this ability to activate the system in response to something. And they immediately said, what is our role? Not what is my role as an individual or as an organization, but what is our role as a system? And I found that so incredible. And I think it's partly because they were visible to one another, they were connected, but also because they had done this scenarios work that was about them as a whole. Um,
So there's a
and
shared
they had
identity.
created their own scenarios for this is the future of their own system, not some experts telling them what the future of the system is, but their own story. And so it was that awareness of the scenarios which fed into the theory of change, and then and it doesn't mean that they're accountable legally, or the accountability still sits at the organizational level, of course, like employment, legal, all that kind of stuff, right? But the awareness, and the sense of agency, and there is a collective we
Yeah, the
that is
shift from the I to the we, and
yeah.
that's a really interesting thing, because you talk a lot about this subtle work, right? And it sounds like, and I think it relates, you saw Niels's question, so maybe you wanna speak to that, but also Magdalena has a question in the Q&A. She'd like to know, she'd be interested to know how the selection of people involved in that sustainable fashion collaboration took place? Bottom up, top down? How was diversity ensured that the people who are usually not in the room actually were?
Yeah, so we do this very deliberately, and of course, there is an exclusion dynamic because it's not if you just do a voluntary kind of who wants to join kind of thing, the balance is going to be off because you're going to have a lot of activists, or you're going to have people who have time, you're going to have consultants who see it as a network. You're going to have all of that. Um, and so the way that we work is that we curate these groups quite carefully. So we do the stakeholder mapping and say, what are all the different roles, not necessarily starting with people. What are all the different roles in this system? And how can we find people who reflect those roles, but not necessarily as kind of representatives of specific, like it's not like you become the voice of the youth. We just want to make sure that we have people who can identify with youth in the group, and that the group is representative of that bigger system. And ideally, if people are wearing more than one hat, so it's really designing the system as a whole.
Mm.
So um, people are wearing more than one hat. They play more than one role. Ideally, we actually try and find people who where it's kind of counterintuitive and not reinforcing stereotypes. So, um, for example, that the racial makeup of the group wouldn't necessarily reflect your stereotypical ideas about the racial makeup of the group, or you have a person. This is from a different process around justice in Mexico. There was, for example, a trans woman who was also a judge, you know. So you're wearing multiple hats, but you're sort of also countering the stereotypes by when people then encounter each other in the process. It's sort of like, oh, okay. We had another process on justice in the Netherlands where like we have to make sure that the judges aren't all white, and the former offenders aren't all people of color. Like that would just be reinforcing stereotypes, and it's not the reality, but it's also just doesn't help us to learn if we do that. So it's like it's quite a careful curation of what are the different roles, what are different dimensions of diversity that we want to pull in, what stereotypes do we need to pay attention to not reinforcing, how do we also avoid that people are having experiences of what you call onlyness. If you're the only young person, or even if you're the only government person or the only private sector person, if you're the only private sector person, you may be powerful in society, but if you're surrounded by a group of people from civil society, you're going to be feeling very attacked and excluded, right? So these are the kinds of things we really kind of design the group as a whole, and then invite people to join based on recommendations. And so in some cases there are applications as well, but it's not a like whoever wants to join can join, at least in that core group. And then you can do other events and things where anybody who wants to can join, or other forms of membership. And, you can still find other forms of inclusion.
Yeah. So it's really about this consciousness around the invitation and the
Yeah.
curation. Like you said, you make it the choice also sometimes to open things up and they're public. And sometimes we have the principle, whoever comes are the right people. But in some
Yeah.
cases, curating that, right? So it's that piece about what do you want to learn and how do you want to engage. There's one more question from Niels, and then I do want to open it up to hear some voices. And he asked about what roles are there in this kind of work, and obviously ask for a framework, and we'll check resources afterwards. But
In terms of the serving it, or delivery of
in
it.
this kind of work, Niels, is that in terms of delivering
Yeah.
it? You can tell us no.
Not in terms of the people in the group, right? I don't think I see the Q&A.
Yeah, I think it's Christine and I prompting that.
Okay, that is what it is.
Okay,
Okay.
we're gonna get
So
more and more questions, and I do wanna open it up, so I just wanna let people know to please
yeah.
put their hands up so they can join, because I put a question in the chat.
Okay. Oh, there, I
So,
see the Q&A.
our roles, yeah.
So um yeah, so I mean, well, there's the roles in the group itself. I mean, you can look at, of course, we start with sort of private sector, government, civil society, and then social movements, INGOs. You can sort of break it down, but then also different forms of diversity is going to depend on the issue. Like for some issues, disability is going to be very important. For other issues, doesn't matter. Gender, in some cases geography matters, and so different kinds of groupings, and also sometimes like different political perspectives. Is it we making sure that the group isn't too left wing, these kinds of things. So that's in terms of the group itself. In terms of the group that's serving it, it's really important not to glorify the facilitation role as if it's the only role here. um, so the holding of the container, which I guess is quite familiar to you. So who's curating the container, the physical container? In some cases, there's also a sort of maybe even psychosocial support around the container. And then there's the convener role. And we tend to distinguish between the convener and the facilitator because the convener is a leadership role, and the facilitator is really a kind of serving the process type of role. And the convener needs to kind of be holding the torch of the process, whereas the facilitator is guiding it and making sure all the voices are included and so on. So even if conveners have the capability to facilitate, we tend to kind of have different people in those roles. And then there's, different documentation, all those kinds of things.
Thanks. Maybe I can open up
Mhm.
to anyone who puts their hand up. Christine will help you come onto stage. We'd really like to have a little bit of peer sharing and hear from you. What do you find the toughest bits in doing this work in your own context? Maybe how you overcome that. I don't know, Christine, if anybody already put their hand up when I prompted the question earlier, but we'd love to invite you here into the spotlight. Or someone. We have some good diversity in this group. So we'll just give it a moment. This is your chance to.
Sorry, can I just say one other thing about the roles is I think I mentioned the kind of sectoral societal diversity and so on, but there is also something about we don't often know this in advance and it tends to work out, but some people really shine when there's like brainstorming, and other people really shine when the group has to agree on something, and some people really help everybody to gel, and sometimes there's an elder in the group that's just, bringing a level of calm and wisdom into the space. So there is also roles at that level, but that's harder to know from the beginning. It's more something that we sort of facilitate towards for people's, the sort of the personalities that and the different gifts and strengths that people have for those to show up as well.
Yeah. So it's a good way to learn about our strengths, right? And how to work in teams. I mean, this is always
Mhm.
important work to do in teams. I think we have Jesper has his hand up. Jesper from Stockholm. Welcome. Good morning.
Morning. I don't know.
Oh, we just lost
I
you.
don't know if you
Oh,
can see.
now we can hear you.
There you are. Hi.
Hello.
We are in a bit of a. Can you turn that off somehow? Now in another
Yeah, you're coming in and
screen.
out.
We're watching here as a presentation. And regarding your question, we talked about this in our context. There's something opportunities that everybody is looking at from their own perspective. They want to do their own thing, all focusing on that same sort of funding of we want to do, right? So there's a lot of competition in them as it is in our context. Still, it's a big challenge in our context anyway. Section on that question, Tatiana.
So what's the toughest bit? Sorry, you came in and out a bit.
Yes,
There's some
in our
background.
context, it's a lot that we have a lot of initiatives, great initiatives, but we are all get the same funding, so competing around funding to drive this. So that's one thing, and the other thing is that their own thing. So there's lots about I have a vision. I have this I want to do, but when it comes to collaborating with unlikely allies and for a higher purpose, there's always the I have a fantastic organization. Plus, say, oh, I have this great idea. I want to do this. Focus on their idea, which is fantastic. It's about themselves, and I want to do this, and it sort of goes sideways. This radical collaboration. My idea, we are running for the same type of partners, etc. So it's a bit of a challenge. Context where we come a long way when it comes to internship and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Any comments on funding?
Yeah, no, I do. Well, I mean, I think for one thing, it's a problem that funders are,
Maybe
it's
you
a
can.
problem that the funders are encouraging competition rather than encouraging collaboration, right? So there's work being done on that as well, on how the funders can encourage collaboration. And I think it's worth, what I often say is, like, if we're constrained by the incentives, we need to try and work together to change the incentives. So one thing you can do is to try and work with others to change the way the funders are working, right? And there are people who are doing that kind of work. But the other thing is, I think it is important to remember that, and it sounds like this is probably excessive competition, but that competition is also healthy in an ecosystem. So how do we embrace some of the healthy competition, that people actually can also be a good sport about it? And I think we've even competed with Impact Hub for some funds, and I think we both lost. So that was good. But whoever won, we shake the hand and say, good for you, right? So I think there is also some level of competition that we should acknowledge as healthy. um um I think the other thing is to, what we said earlier about needs. I think it's really important not to slide into the level where we're saying, like, oh, we all just have to work for the higher purpose and set aside our other needs. The point is, like, how can we work towards the higher purpose and meet the needs that are in the system and articulate those needs? And so there are needs at different levels, and if we're asking people to sacrifice their own ideas, their own drives, their own ideas for the bigger purpose, then then we get Trump. So I think that's the other thing, is, like, acknowledging the people's needs, acknowledging their drive, acknowledging their ideas. But at the same time, I agree there is also something harmful about people just thinking that they can just do something because they have the idea without acknowledging who else is already there. And I think this is the point to the two things to do is, one is to notice the ways in which we're counteracting what we're trying to achieve. So, like, how is this dynamic preventing us collectively to achieve what we want to achieve? How's it actually working against something that you believe in? But also, and this is where it gets trickier, but raising the awareness about the harm that you can actually be doing if you think you can just come up with an idea and go out and fundraise without acknowledging the people who've been there for 10 years trying to do the same thing, without collaborating with them, without partnering with them. And I actually I think there's a colonial almost dimension to that, and I see that in the social change space, even in the systems change space, all the time. Like, people think, oh, I want to make a difference in education, and so I'm going to start an education project. You're not doing any assessment of who else is already doing that work, who's been there, who's studied it, who's done it. And you just kind of go out and announce yourself as a hero in a space that, who's just came in from the cold. So I think that can do harm. And I think it's I do think that is something that we need to really question and challenge people on.
Yeah, I want to
So
throw in a thought.
can I add a question to Impact Hub? Then I've been in the system for a long, driving things forward, doing new stuff. So I very much solve the issues that we have ahead of us with the old, bigger organization that's been 20 years. They also have their structure, and you're saying that, yeah, we need to acknowledge a lot of knowledge. We don't have a lot of experience. Point now in society where we going in the, and why is that? I mean, that's because of our history. Then how do we go back from doing what we've been doing so far, even those bigger organizations, so
Yeah.
so I strive. Even Impact Hub, we've been in business for 20 years, have our system, but we changed over time as well.
Yeah.
So let go of the past, but still experience with you when it comes to radical qualities. I struggle with it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No,
Yeah.
and that comes back to the healthy competition as well, right? So if the old systems are failing and you have a truly a better way, maybe that's just a space of fair competition, right? But I see people overestimating themselves and just occupying territory, and without if you think about colonialism, for example, just like you just land somewhere and you put your flag and you occupy. I think that happens in our space as well, and I think that can cause harm, and it's hubris, so it all depends on the situation, what's actually going on, right?
So I'm going to move us along because I love, and I see many more questions coming in. So I think we have to organize another conversation. Thanks, Jesper, for that. One comment about funders is I found, and it's not easy. So I'm not saying that it's one of the best, some of the best funders I've seen come along are people who have been part of the ecosystem genuinely as people interested in issues or interested in being part of the ecosystem, and not put as like you're the funder, right, on the outside of the system and you just are there to fund. But yeah, welcome from Greece. There, you can frame your question, and then, yeah, we're closing up the session soon, so you're the last voice. We can't hear you.
How is it now?
Now we can.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm Glikeria. I'm from Greece. I'm external to Impact Hub and very much honored to be invited. So I was thinking as you were presenting and speaking to this very interesting topic, what makes difficult for me sometimes when I bring different people in a room is the issue of representation. I mean, you invite the stakeholders group and someone comes in, one person, two people, three people. It's not part of our role, I guess, to make sure that they are actually representing the group you have invited, but we have to be conscious of the internal dynamics, the internal power imbalances of the group you have invited, and the level the representative is actually, speaking on behalf of the group. So it's not part of our role, but we have to be conscious because, as you said, very interestingly, we don't want to do harm. And sometimes when we convene these ecosystems, might have some unintended impact because the representative is not doing their job you expect they do. So an example would be, a local community, a neighborhood, a building block. Someone comes in to discuss the needs, the priorities. Are they really representing the group that has been invited? And that's an issue I always, struggle to make sure I do it right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think maybe a comment on that is that I put in here the capacity to sense constantly, like we said at the beginning, it's a living system, right? You constantly have to sense. So our emergence sometimes is seen as like, oh, it's emergence of something good or a new innovation, but also the unintended impact, right? The unintended consequence is emergence too. It's a property that comes out of something that happened, right? In this sort of living system. So I think this capacity to sense and then be able to choose wise responses and work in a team with different capacities, to me, has been, one of the biggest learnings in doing this work. And we've been through the fire with some of these kinds of pieces, that sometimes it's really hard to go through that. And that's why I admire Mile's work so much.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can wrap up, Mile, because I need to.
Yeah, if I can just say one thing about that piece. So I think in some cases there are processes like parliament and so on where people are elected representatives, right? They've been elected. So if they've been given a mandate by their people, we need to trust them to represent that voice, right? If they haven't been given a mandate, which is usually the case in our processes, they're there as individuals and they're speaking as an individual. So there's an awareness of the fact that they're not there to represent. What I find happens is mostly people do step into that role just in the dynamic, because if you're the only young person in a certain, or if you're two or three young people in a group, you do feel a responsibility to speak as a young person, right? So I think it kind of happens naturally, but I also don't think that role fluidity is necessarily a bad thing. Like I've also had 70-year-olds, speaking on behalf of the youth, and I think that's also beautiful. So I think, as long as all the voices are showing up, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the expected place. And it's very beautiful when it doesn't. But if I, as a facilitator, feel like someone's being overlooked or there's a voice missing, I might just say that, like, do you think disabled people are being, do you think their voice is being sufficiently represented in this group, or can others think about like what would so and so say if they were here, that kind of thing? There are other ways of bringing it in, or through learning journeys or other things. But yeah, I think it's really important to distinguish this piece around mandate and participating as individuals, and also to allow for that role fluidity to happen, and sense, as you say, Tatjana, about when a voice is missing, either because they don't feel comfortable expressing themselves, and then you can work with that, or if you need to kind of bring it in, or ask the question in a different way.
Well said.
Thank you.
You can always tell the fluidity of the work from a real practitioner, that you're able to articulate this in so many ways, and, the nuances of some of the challenges. So we are winding up. I am asking if people do have other questions that you can park them here. We will capture them and have a follow-up. But I also really want to thank you for joining, because we've had this conversation saying, well, why are we competing out there? And we also had Social Business in our opening sessions having the same question. I'm talking to leaders of other networks, and it's just saying, well, we really do need to shift the conditions in the game out there. And part of this means we need to weave better together our complementarity in the wider ecosystem. So I want to thank you for taking your time out of all of this really important work to share with us. I don't know if you have any last words of wisdom.
No, thank you. It was great, and I would love to engage more, and to engage more with the questions, but I also have other places to be. So
You do.
this was a good intense exchange.
Yeah, thank you. And
Thanks very much.
better yet, let's find a system to work on together. And if so Rios is a friend of Impact Hub. Thank you very much. I am going to bridge to the next session, which gets very pragmatic about what we've been learning in our own system. So I think, Christine, you're going to help me out with some slides here. And we're going to take a step back here into why issue-based ecosystem for Impact Hub. So Christine, slide 1, if you could put it on, and you can move Millet out of the spotlight. Super, super. So we've been asking ourselves these questions also about, how do we as hubs, beyond, running spaces and communities, how do we start to address some of the complex problems we've been witnessing, like Jesper, in some cases for 20 years, right, in our society? How do we look at really creating the conditions for collaborative innovation, right? Believing it's not about the hero entrepreneur who's going to save the day here, but really about collaboration, right? How do we help to accelerate the transition in hopefully the right direction? How do we build business and resilience through this, but also amplify influence and advocacy, right? So it's also about really building, again, that influence. Some of the rules of the game have to change. Some of the, we need policymakers in the room. We need to be able to also advocate for those voices that are not often, heard about in transitions, as Millie alluded to. There's a lot of different things that we can do. And so these are some of the whys behind us looking at this. And in our roadmap that we kicked off 2 years ago, we said we really want to understand that, we're doing beyond any, running co-working spaces, we're doing place-based innovation. We are really creating, opportunities outside of our Impact Hub walls. Actually, sometimes there's more Impact Hub right outside of our 4 walls, because there are like-minded people who maybe aren't called Impact Hub or makers or such like that, who also want to shift things. So what we've been doing is looking at what are the practices in the network that we've noticed over the last few years. And we start to build a playbook. So again, I am very, very careful here to caution us that this is not about being reductionist and reducing everything to dots, even though we have some beautiful visuals that are dots. But it's constantly this question, right? About how are we learning from our own work, and how are we reflecting it back to ourselves, so we can support more of us, particularly if you're not doing this already, to learn how to do it and apply this in your context. So next slide is what we're doing is building this playbook. Christine, next slide. Thank you. Is essentially what we call 6 moments. And so the next session goes into much more detail around this. There's 6 moments. And again, whether you look at, what Rios is doing, what some of the research or such that I've done before, what any Impact Hub is doing, what we start to notice is similar as these sort of 6 moments or phases: to understand, to engage, to convene, to activate, consolidate and amplify. Often people get as far as, oh, we activate it and then we have all these things going on and don't think of that convergence part. How do we actually consolidate and amplify? How do we embody it? How do we really make sure that this gets, really, I guess, implanted as a new way of doing? As so Jesper said, we want to shift the system and make this almost like, the new way going forward as such, or getting, embedded in institutions and ways of doing. So we're not constantly rehashing the same issues. So this is really the very, very high level view. The next session goes into detail around what we've been learning around these. These are not prescriptive. Under all of these moments, there are different methodologies and approaches. So for example, Niels mentioned Knafen. Knafen to me is a great model for understanding complexity, right? Mile mentioned a couple of methodologies. Some of us work with social technologies, also like World Cafe, open space. So there's a ton of methodologies. We're not trying to say this is another methodology, right? In place of those, what we're trying to present here is like a playbook or a blueprint to say the way that we use those at different moments in time help us build this way forward. Next slide. And so again, it's not about, it's going beyond connecting the dots, obviously, in this. And the next slide is really, this playbook is a little preview. So you can see here, it's kind of a screenshot of all that. So the next session, Tom and Angie are going to lead us through understanding the different sort of chapters of this playbook. It's tested and it's built from makers, bottom up. Some of you have been involved in giving input to this and codifying this. Thank you very much, our brand and comms team, who has made this look beautiful. But the idea there is that we practice it and we learn from it and we reflect on it and we refine it. But again, it's not about checking off boxes in a methodology. It's about us sharing stories. As you see, the power of hearing a story, right, of a fashion lab in Brazil, is it about us sharing stories from our different contexts, but having some shared language to create coherence around our learning, so that our learning can be applied to furthering this work. But it's also to support you in your own efforts to engage stakeholders, perhaps funders, different allies, to say, actually, this is we do have a methodology in Impact Hub. We do have a way of creating this from all of our experience over years across different contexts. You can borrow stories from other contexts and other Impact Hubs, and talk to folks who might be sharing either, similar challenges or, similar questions, to be able to say, well, what if we tried it here and how would we adapt it to our own context locally with the players that are important to convene in the way that we want to convene that. So that's really, I think, one of our best gifts, is our capacity to adapt and contextualize and work with what is present in your own place and space. Next slide. Just to finish it off, going forward, is I just wanted to mention that, here you'll look at like the tools and methodologies, really gain an understanding, but also thinking about, how do you apply this as you're planning next year for, I know a lot of you are challenged with like, how are we going to make our business work next year, right? So it's really, how can you consider ecosystem building, issue-based ecosystems, the issues that you want to transition your society as part of your work in society to really build on, the community and the connections that you already have, but actually really create, something longer term, multi-year, perhaps legacy, to really bring, as we mentioned, that experience over the past. And so this is where we're going to go into a little bit more depth. You can ask a lot of questions, get pragmatic. And what we'd like to do, we're baking into our global year plan, is how do we really play with this over the next year to learn more about this and to learn what kinds of partners we can be building also. Thank you, Egmile is an example, right? Of Rios, at regional and global levels, to maybe support more of this work in a translocal approach. So that's my little pitch for next session. I think we'll leave it there. A couple of us might hang out for a few minutes if there's anything further that you'd like to say or do. But otherwise, I would really like to thank you all to go get a glass of water, a little breath stretch before you join that session, because it's pretty dense. And hopefully we can continue this conversation between us. So thank you very much. And don't forget to hang out in the lounge in between all your other sessions.